In early August 2022, 29-year-old Lily Lindsay strode out of a nail salon in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, feeling especially polished. Usually, she did her own nails with an at-home gel manicure kit, but today, she'd gotten her nails done at a fancy salon, and she had even paid extra for eyebrow threading. Lily had really spent a lot of money over the past week to make herself as beautiful as possible. Her best friend's wedding was in 2 days, and Lily really wanted to look absolutely perfect for the photos. To Lily, looking her absolute best was another way of showing her friend how excited she was for her big day. Lily ran through a short mental checklist of everything she still had to get done before the wedding. She needed to pick up her dress from the tailor and get decorations and snacks for the bridal suite. But before she could do any of that, she had one more appointment. She was getting a facial. Lily decided to grab an iced coffee on her way to the spa. She walked a few doors down from the nail salon to a little cafe on the corner. And as she walked in, she caught a glimpse of herself in the store window, and she couldn't help but smile, because she was beautiful and elegant, and so she could barely wait to see how amazing she would look with her full hair done and makeup and her dress on. It had been hectic helping her best friend bring the wedding together, but she could not be more excited for the weekend ahead. The wedding would end up being even more incredible than Lily had hoped, and she had really high expectations. And 10 days later, Lily still felt like she was recovering from it. She stumbled from her bed to her bathroom, stretching her arms high overhead to try and wake up. She yawned, and she could feel the skin around her mouth start to crack a bit, which seemed strange for summertime. Her skin had not felt this tight and dry since midwinter, when the cold and high winds left her whole face feeling chapped. Lily went to grab her toothbrush, but when she saw herself in the mirror, she stopped. The skin under her eyes was blotchy and red. She leaned in toward the mirror for a better look and traced the outline of the rash with one of her fingers. She'd never had a skin outbreak like this before. Lily opened up her medicine cabinet and looked at the array of skincare products inside. She'd used most of the products for months or even years, but now she wondered if maybe she'd developed an allergic reaction to one of them. So she decided to skip her skincare routine for a few days to see if maybe that would clear up the irritated skin. But Lily's rash didn't get any better. And after 2 weeks of eliminating different face products to see if that helped, she found herself on an examination table at a doctor's office. At this point, she'd stopped using every face serum she owned, but still had not been able to identify what was making her skin break out. In the last few days, her rash had spread across her face and down her neck. The red splotches itched and would sting if she tried to cover them with makeup, so she had to leave the rashes exposed, which made her sort of embarrassed in public. Lily winced as the doctor gently tapped his finger all along her rash. He was being very gentle, but still it burned every time he touched her, almost like salt touching a wound. The doctor stood up and told her not to worry. He'd seen cases like this a dozen times. It was standard-issue dermatitis, which meant a skin irritation, usually caused by an environmental factor like air pollution or exposure to a new allergen. He was confident that an antibiotic would clear her face up in no time. Lily was so relieved. She'd never had particularly sensitive skin, so she was surprised to learn that all of this boiled down to skin irritation, but she was just glad to have a diagnosis and a plan of action. She told the doctor she'd stop at the pharmacy on the way home and grab the antibiotic. A month after Lily's initial visit to her doctor, she was in her room getting ready for a follow-up appointment. She carefully peeled off her pajamas and put on wide-leg jeans and a baggy shirt. These were unfortunately the only clothes she could stand to wear these days, because the rest of her wardrobe fit too snugly and rubbed against her raw skin, which was still totally broken out and incredibly painful. The antibiotics had not worked. Her skin still felt crusty, her lips were so dry that they split every time she laughed. Big blotchy rashes covered her face and neck as well as down her chest and beneath her armpits. They were so painful that Lily often tried to keep her arms raised slightly whenever she walked around, usually with her hands on her hips to avoid chafing. Showering had also become excruciatingly painful. She'd started skipping it as much as she could, which made her feel totally dirty. As Lily walked out the door this time, she hoped this appointment would finally lead her to some answers. She didn't know how much more skin irritation she could take. 30 minutes later, Lily parked her car at the doctor's office and made her way across the parking lot, keeping the hood of her jacket over her head to obscure her face. She knew it was superficial, but she still felt embarrassed to let people see all her blotchy and flaky skin. As Lily checked in with the receptionist and headed into an exam room, she tried not to make eye contact with anybody in the office. As she changed into a hospital gown, she thought how repulsed people would be if they saw her undressed. When the doctor finally entered the exam room a few minutes later, his eyes widened a bit, and Lily knew he was shocked by her appearance. He quickly recovered and acted totally professional, but Lily couldn't help feeling totally ashamed as he asked her about the rash and inspected it on different areas of her body. After a few minutes, the doctor told her that, in his opinion, this seemed like a flare-up of eczema, which is a term for chronically inflamed skin. It's like an extreme case of dermatitis, which is what he'd originally diagnosed her with. But antibiotics don't work against eczema, which is why she was not improving. But he told her not to panic because a steroid cream would clear it up in no time. A few months later, in January of 2023, Lily sat on her couch as a winter storm raged outside. The steroid cream had also not worked. If anything, it only seemed to make her breakout worse. At this point, her skin, in total, was actually more rash than clear. Lily had spent the last few months going to all sorts of doctors. They were all sympathetic to her problem, but ultimately had been unable to help her. It was unbelievably frustrating. Lily felt trapped in her own skin, like she was in a cage she couldn't escape. In fact, Lily's skin troubles had gotten so bad, it was totally affecting her mental health. Her thoughts were starting to get really dark and pessimistic, so she'd gone to a therapist for help. The therapist had prescribed her a low dose of antidepressants, which were helping with some of Lily's racing thoughts and feelings of hopelessness, but they were obviously not a cure for the entire situation she was in. At this point, even if she felt mentally okay, physically she was in so much pain all the time that she couldn't even leave the sofa. So tonight, Lily had wrapped herself in a fuzzy blanket, the only one that didn't scratch at her skin, and ordered herself a pizza. Lily decided to watch a movie, but when she got up to grab the remote, she felt blood rushing to her head and her vision began spinning. Lily eased back onto the couch and closed her eyes, feeling so dizzy it made her nauseous. Then suddenly her ears began to ring, and her chest tightened as she tried to fight back anxious tears. She knew that dizziness and ear ringing were not symptoms of eczema, and so she couldn't help but start wondering if she was actually going to die. This was the final straw. Lily could not just sit around and wait for death, and if the doctors couldn't help, she would just have to solve this puzzle herself. So she slowly got up and very painfully walked over to grab her laptop because now it was time for her to conduct her own research. A few hours later, Lily was crouched over her computer, poring over an article she'd found online. It discussed the symptoms of extreme allergic reactions, and to Lily's surprise, many of her symptoms fit. This entire ordeal really did seem like one big allergic reaction. But Lily still had no idea what she might be allergic to. So she started looking up common allergies, until she found a couple that sounded like hers. She discovered that some people are actually extremely allergic to the latex from the balloons that she had actually used during her friend's wedding to create custom arrangements. Now, Lily had never had a problem with latex before, but the article said that allergies could develop later in life. She also found that home nail polish kits, like the ones she used, can cause allergies too, as the chemicals seep into people's bodies through the nail bed. Lily started thinking that surely there must be a way to test whether these chemicals were making her break out so horribly. And so for the first time in 5 months, Lily felt like she kind of had a plan here, and so hope began to spark inside of her. She would call her doctor first thing in the morning, and hopefully they could, together, get to the bottom of this thing once and for all. A few days later, on a Friday afternoon, Lily sat on an allergist's examination table with her hands on her knees. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her rash-covered back was fully exposed. She winced as her doctor taped a bunch of small patches to her back. To Lily, the patches looked like little strips of bubble wrap, but actually, they were allergy patch test strips, and each of the little bubbles contained a different allergen. Lily clenched her jaw. The strips were already beginning to itch, partially because they were stuck to her rash, which was sensitive already, and partially because they'd stuck more than 200 chemical samples to her back, including latex and the chemicals from her at-home nail kit. So she was bound to be allergic to at least a few of these things. When the doctor finished his work, he explained to Lily that unfortunately, she would have to leave all of these test strips on her back all weekend, no matter how much they irritated her. She nodded, though she was absolutely dreading the discomfort the next few days would bring. But she told herself that if she could just push through to Monday, she would almost certainly have an answer, and then this nightmare could finally be over. By Monday morning, when Lily drove her car into the doctor's office parking lot, she wanted to rip those test strips off her back and light them on fire. It had been the most miserable weekend of her life. The only thing that had gotten her through the very itchy discomfort was knowing that each little sting she was feeling was a positive reaction to an allergen and a possible answer to her problems. As she strode into the doctor's office, her clothes billowed all around her because she could only wear really baggy clothes, and there were bags under her eyes because she hadn't slept well either, so she was quite the sight. But Lily prayed that it would all be over soon, because in a few short minutes, she would know exactly what was causing this excruciating rash. Except that's not what happened. Lily's doctor peeled off all the patches and explained that he could only see a few mild allergic reactions, but nothing that could cause a reaction this bad all over her body. Lily couldn't understand. Her symptoms had matched an extreme allergic reaction perfectly, especially to latex or the at-home nail gel. She was so sure she was on the right track, and now she just felt defeated. Lily drove home in a stupor. She felt like her life was now this living hell. She thought back to the previous summer, mad at herself for not appreciating how good her life used to be. She'd give anything to go back to the day of her best friend's wedding and just look like her old self again. She ran her tongue over the veneers she'd gotten for the wedding. Her smile was the only part of her physical appearance that she liked now, but she would give it up in a second to get her old skin back. But just then, a thought hit her like a lightning bolt, and she actually pulled her car over so quickly that the tires screeched. Once she came to a stop, she immediately began rifling through her purse for her phone, and as her heart raced, she thought to herself she'd been going to the wrong doctor. That was the issue, and now she desperately needed to make an appointment with the right one. 2 days later, Lily sat in her dentist chair. She told him that in her quest to look perfect for her friend's wedding, she suspected that she had accidentally set herself up for months of misery. She was just sure she had discovered the cause of her extreme rash. When the dentist looked skeptical, Lily told him about the article she'd found online about extreme allergies. And suddenly, the dentist understood too. Lily had a strong suspicion that her problems had all been caused by the gels in her at-home nail kit. But it was more complicated than that. In fact, the online article Lily read talked about the way nail gels can make people dangerously allergic to other everyday things. That's because the acrylic-based plastic in the gel can seep into someone's nail bed and make them allergic to anything else that contains acrylic. In Lily's case, that would be the veneers she had applied to her teeth to look beautiful for the wedding. The veneers were loaded with acrylic-based plastic, and her body had a very powerful reaction to it. Essentially, Lily had poison glued to her front teeth for the last 6 months, which triggered a constant, severe allergic reaction. Ultimately, the dentist ground the veneers off of Lily's teeth in April of 2023, and slowly but surely, the rash became less painful. By the summer of 2023, Lily's skin was back to normal, and she felt like herself again. There's really no way to know for sure whether the at-home gel manicure kit had triggered her allergy, but either way, Lily has steered clear of them ever since. Here is our second and final story called No Warning. On the morning of August 15th, 2020, 16-year-old Rohan Gadhania stood in his kitchen mixing up a protein shake. He was trying to put on some muscle before school started in a few weeks. Rohan took a sip and grimaced. The shake was thick and chalky, which he just was not expecting because he did not often drink protein shakes. But Rohan was never one to back down from a challenge, so he adjusted his glasses and steeled himself, then gulped the whole shake down. When he was done, he slammed the glass down on the counter in triumph. He told himself he was going to learn to like those shakes because he was going to get jacked. Rohan put the dirty glass in the dishwasher, then bounded up the stairs to his bedroom on the second floor, already feeling stronger. In truth, he was a very skinny kid, especially for his age. And even though Rohan knew he had a lot going for him, good grades, a bright future, a very winning personality, he really wanted big muscles, or at least to weigh more than a 12-year-old. Rohan opened the door to his bedroom and made a beeline for his piano keyboard. Rohan was a very accomplished musician and loved practicing just about every day. But this morning, he stopped himself and instead turned toward the Nintendo Wii game system hooked up to the television on top of his dresser. He grabbed the Wii remote and began browsing through Wii Fit games until he came to strength training. Rohan thought that if he started right now and kept on sucking down those protein shakes, maybe he really could build some actual muscle by the time classes resumed. At lunchtime, Rohan's father, Hitendra, made sandwiches for the two of them and then called Rohan to the kitchen table. But while Hitendra wolfed his meal down in about 4 bites, he noticed that his son barely touched his food. Rohan told him his stomach hurt, and Hitendra just nodded, understanding. He told his son it was fine if he didn't want to finish his lunch, and encouraged Rohan to go lie down and take a nap. Hopefully that would settle his stomach. Rohan smiled at his father and then left the kitchen. Once the boy was gone, Hitendra picked up Rohan's plate and began to tidy up. But then he heard the distinct sound of dry heaving coming from the upstairs bathroom. Hitendra dropped the plates into the sink and hurried upstairs to check on Rohan, who he found kneeling over the toilet. Rohan retched repeatedly as his father rubbed his back reassuringly. Then Hitendra suggested Rohan stay in bed for the rest of the day. It seemed like he must have picked up some kind of stomach bug. Once Rohan was in his bed with a waste can nearby just in case, Hitendra went back downstairs and found the protein powder he'd gotten for Rohan. It was the only unusual thing Rohan had eaten over the past couple of days, and Hitendra wondered if it had gone bad or had some strange ingredients in it. Hitendra scanned the label, and he saw the expiration date was not for a while, and none of the ingredients stood out to him as unusual or alarming, so he shrugged and put the protein powder back where it went in the cupboard, convinced his son would feel better by morning. But when Hitendra went to check on Rohan the next morning, the boy was as white as a sheet. Rohan admitted he'd vomited a few times overnight and that he felt even worse than the day before. The boy propped himself up in bed, squinting. Hitendra thought his son might be looking for his glasses, so Hitendra told Rohan they were on the nightstand. Rohan nodded slowly, but then he started looking around the room as if he didn't know where to find his own nightstand. Hitendra frowned and just pointed at the nightstand, and Rohan's face suddenly lit up as though he was pleasantly surprised to even find a table there. Now, Hitendra couldn't help but feel more concern for his son. He wondered if Rohan was so dehydrated that he was confused. So he helped Rohan downstairs and sat him at the kitchen table while he went to grab a bottle of the sports drink they always kept in the pantry. But when Hitendra returned to the kitchen carrying his son's drink, his son suddenly seemed even stranger. Rohan glared at his father with utter contempt. When Hitendra asked if everything was okay, Rohan snapped that his father should mind his own business. Then Rohan got up so aggressively that the table shook. Then Rohan just stood there staring icily at his father. This was very unlike Rohan, and so Hitendra knew something had to be deeply wrong. Rohan was so gentle normally, but now he was erratic and aggressive and confused. Hitendra knew his son needed to see a doctor, but something told him it was just not safe to try to take Rohan to the hospital by himself right now, like not in this state, something was terribly wrong. So to play it very safe, Hitendra just called an ambulance. A few hours later, Rohan's mother, Pushpa, arrived at West Middlesex Hospital, where the paramedics had taken her son. She kept telling herself that Rohan would be just fine, but Pushpa still felt incredibly anxious as she entered the hospital lobby. Her husband, Hitendra, met her in the hallway outside of Rohan's room and explained that Rohan had become increasingly agitated on his way to the hospital, and he kept trying to get up and move around the ambulance on the way, and Hitendra actually had to physically restrain him on the stretcher to keep him from jumping out the back doors. Pushpa just blinked in surprise at this incredibly strange turn of events. Rohan was just not the type of boy to fly into a rage, let alone leap out of a moving vehicle, and so fear began creeping into Pushpa's mind, much the way it had already creeped into Hitendra's mind. And so Pushpa followed Hitendra into Rohan's hospital room, hoping to find Rohan back to himself and feeling better, but instead, Rohan was sitting up in bed, hunched over a kidney-shaped bowl and vomiting. Pushpa felt instant sympathy for her son as she watched him throw up, but that wasn't the worst of it. There were tubes hooked up to Rohan's arms, and wires patched to his chest, leading to all sorts of whirring and beeping machines. Whatever was wrong with Rohan was clearly more serious than just the flu or some other minor ailment. Pushpa looked back at Hitendra, whose eyes were full of concern. Hitendra explained that Rohan had been deteriorating ever since they arrived at the hospital, and the doctors still had no idea what was making Rohan sick. Rohan was complaining of intense abdominal pain and kept forgetting where he was or how he'd even gotten there. Suddenly, the knot in Pushpa's chest tightened and her breathing quickened as she grappled with what Hitendra was saying. And so, kind of panicking, she just stepped out into the hallway and let out a scream of absolute despair. Her son was falling apart before her eyes, and there wasn't anything she could do. She felt so hopeless. Pushpa bent over and braced her hands on her knees, sucking in long breaths of air. When she finally felt like she had collected herself, she went back into the hospital room and planted a kiss on Rohan's forehead. She told her son everything was going to be fine, even though inside she didn't know that. Then she stood next to Hitendra, gripping his hand tightly. Over the next few hours, Pushpa and Hitendra paced the hospital room as their son alternated between moments of confusion and extreme agitation. All the while, doctors and nurses came in and out, explaining all the tests and treatments they were doing to try to figure out what was wrong. The doctors said that they suspected that Rohan was suffering from some kind of inflammation around the spinal column and brain, and so they started him on medication right away for the two most likely conditions, which were meningitis and encephalopathy. For a little while, Rohan did seem to get better with the medication. But just before midnight, he started to get restless and agitated again, and he began trying to jump out of the bed, which would have torn out all the wires and IV lines. And so Hitendra did his best to hold the teenager down, while Pushpa repeatedly pressed the call button for help. A moment later, two nurses were in Rohan's room, attaching restraints to Rohan's wrists so that he couldn't get out of bed. A doctor said that Rohan was getting too unstable to remain in a regular hospital room, and he directed the nurses to move him to the intensive care unit. Pushpa was shocked. She knew Rohan was sick, but she still couldn't believe his condition had gotten this bad, and so she had to fight to hold in another scream. The nurse said that Rohan would be sedated once he got upstairs, and he would likely be asleep for hours. She urged Pushpa and Hitendra to go home for the night and then come back rested in the morning. Pushpa hated the idea of leaving her son, but she also knew that he'd be under close watch in the ICU without them. And if Rohan was going to be in the hospital for a few days, she and Hitendra would need some sleep. So they followed the medical team to the ICU, and they stayed with their son until he fell asleep, and then after kissing their boy goodnight, the parents headed home. When they got there, Pushpa threw on some pajamas and crawled into bed, but she felt like she was not going to be able to sleep. She just stared at the ceiling, thinking of her son, and she would lay there, her thoughts racing, until about 5 a.m., when her phone started ringing. It was the hospital. The doctor explained that Rohan's condition had actually taken another serious turn for the worse over the night. Rohan was now struggling so hard to breathe that he had to be intubated and put on a ventilator, which meant that a machine was now keeping him alive. Absolutely shocked and terrified, Pushpa shook Hitendra awake, and then she ran to wake up their 17-year-old daughter, Alicia, and then the three of them threw on their shoes and raced to the hospital. By the time they arrived, Rohan's doctor was there to meet them. The doctor admitted that they were struggling to get Rohan stabilized, but he was not actually in immediate danger. Once he was stable, they planned to do another CT scan so they'd have a better picture of what was going on in his brain. Pushpa felt like she was going to faint, so she sank into one of the chairs that lined the pale blue hallway of the ICU. She was vaguely aware that Hitendra and Alicia had sat down on either side of her, and each had taken one of her hands. After the doctor left, Hitendra squeezed Pushpa's hand and reminded her that while all of this sounded terrifying, Rohan was in good hands here. Pushpa wanted to believe that, but the drumbeat of bad news over and over and over again was making it hard for her to be optimistic. Pushpa sat tensely by Rohan's bed for the entire day, willing her boy to get better. Rohan's doctor came to check in every few hours, assuring them that Rohan would get his CT scan once he was stable enough. And then finally, in the late afternoon, technicians were able to perform that CT scan of Rohan's brain. And then, around 6 p.m., Rohan's doctor slowly walked into his room, staring at the floor. The doctor took a deep breath and looked Pushpa in the eye. He told her that Rohan had severe swelling in his brain, which can be fatal if it's not controlled. The doctor said he had already called the neurosurgery department at nearby Charing Cross Hospital, but the team there had said they could not, in good conscience, operate on Rohan to relieve the pressure. Given the extent of his brain injury and meningitis, they were not confident he would survive the surgery. Pushpa struggled to understand what the doctor was even saying, that essentially her son was too far gone to help. She hadn't even considered this possibility. Her boy was only 16 years old. Despite all her worry over the past few days, she had fully believed her son would eventually get better. He had to. Pushpa told the doctor he had to be wrong, but the look on the man's face said everything. Her boy was beyond helping. The following evening, on August 18th, Pushpa sat on the edge of Rohan's bed, her hand wrapped around his. Rohan lay motionless, still intubated and hooked up to IVs and machines. Hitendra and Rohan's sister, Alicia, sat nervously on the other side of Rohan's bed. Rohan's doctor was leaning over him, essentially checking the teen for signs of life. He stood and slowly turned to Pushpa and her family. He looked truly sad as he said that Rohan showed no brain activity. Then he said he would give them time to say their goodbyes, and he left the room. Pushpa stroked her son's hand, still unable to accept what was happening. Alicia tucked a teddy bear under Rohan's arms. He'd had it since he was a baby, and still slept with it every night in the corner of his bed. The whole family knew he'd want his bear to be with him now. For the rest of the afternoon, the family sat in silence as they struggled to say goodbye to Rohan. And then finally, at 5:03 p.m., Rohan passed away, and Pushpa's heart shattered. But her family did not get much time to grieve, only a few minutes. A doctor entered the room and asked Pushpa and Hitendra to consider donating Rohan's organs. He apologized for how quickly they'd need to make this decision, but organs need to be harvested for transplant as soon after death as possible. The doctor knew it was small consolation, but he said that Rohan's death could very likely save other lives. The doctor then held out some lengthy forms. The idea of filling out paperwork in the same hour that her young son died was repulsive to Pushpa. But she understood, and she knew what decision Rohan would have made. And so she and Hitendra took the forms and agreed to donate Rohan's organs. A few weeks later, Pushpa sat in Rohan's bedroom back at their home outside of London, holding his teddy bear to her chest. It was the only one of his belongings that she'd touched since her son had died. The grief of losing a child was almost more than she could bear, and since his death, something else had really been eating at her. Pushpa still didn't even know what had made Rohan sick, and because they had donated his organs, there hadn't been time to conduct an autopsy, and so she was really struggling to accept that she'd just never learned what had killed him. Pushpa worried that if what had killed Rohan was something genetic or environmental, his sister Alicia might also be at risk. But more than anything, she wanted to know if something could have been done to save Rohan. It just felt like this huge question mark was looming over her family's head, occupying every waking thought. 13 months after Rohan's death, so in September of 2021, Hitendra ignored Pushpa's running commentary on his wild driving as he weaved in and out of traffic. They were on the way home from Alicia's university. They'd just finished moving her into the dorms for the fall semester, which felt even more bittersweet than Hitendra had anticipated. He and Pushpa were empty nesters now, but only because Rohan was gone. Hitendra did not want to go home and cook a dinner for just 2 people. He was about to bring up the possibility of maybe going out to a restaurant when Pushpa's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but for some reason, the hair on the back of Hitendra's neck pricked up, and he told Pushpa to please answer it. And so Pushpa did, and she connected her phone to the car speaker so they could both listen. The man on the other line sounded grim. He explained that he was from the National Health Service blood and transplant team, the people who harvested their son's organs for transplant. Hitendra exchanged a quick, surprised glance with Pushpa as this man went on. The man said they needed Pushpa and Hitendra to come into the office for an urgent meeting. Hitendra was confused, but offered to drive straight to the office. They could be there within the hour. The man said that would be great and thanked them. Hitendra felt more curious than alarmed, so he pushed the gas pedal a bit faster as Pushpa reset the GPS to their new destination. What Pushpa and Hitendra learned at this meeting absolutely shocked them. The National Health Service team member explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver had become gravely ill earlier that year. A biopsy on the liver that had come from Rohan revealed a very dangerous condition with a very complicated name. It's called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, or OTCD for short. OTCD is a genetic condition that prevents the body from breaking down ammonia, which can cause the toxic chemical to build up to lethal levels in the bloodstream. The man explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver didn't have OTCD before his transplant surgery, so the illness had to come from the donated liver, Rohan's liver. And so the team member told the parents that their son almost certainly suffered from OTCD. Finally, 13 months after Rohan had passed away, his parents knew what had actually killed him. Pushpa and Hitendra stared at each other in disbelief. They were relieved to get some answers, but they didn't know anything about OTCD and why it would have suddenly killed Rohan like that, and so they asked for more information. The NHS team member explained that some people with OTCD don't even know they have it because the disease is inactive. However, the illness can be triggered by a big dose of protein. And in Rohan's case, he had drank a huge protein shake on the morning he got sick. He'd never consumed so much protein before so quickly, and his body basically couldn't handle it. And so that's what prompted him to get sick. Pushpa and Hitendra were obviously devastated. If they'd only known about Rohan's kind of inactive condition, they would have never let him drink protein shakes like that. Now, could that have forever prevented him from getting the disease? They don't know. But certainly, that protein shake is what prompted it. Thankfully, though, it does not seem likely that their daughter has OTCD, which affects an estimated 1,000 people in the United Kingdom alone. More studies are being conducted on OTCD, but as far as we know, it is extremely dangerous, killing about 50% of infants diagnosed with it at birth, and around 10% of people diagnosed with it when they're 16 or older, which was Rohan's age. However, there were no warnings that the protein powder that Rohan ingested could trigger this terrible disease. Rohan's experience ultimately prompted calls for new warnings to be printed on all supermarket-bought protein shakes in the UK. In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect, but looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors, they both got married at almost the exact same time, their kids had grown up together, and now Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luc was his best friend, the policeman said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luc was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first-year exam. And without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school, and so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies. And eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. And because he's this very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this lie for almost 20 years, His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody he has told that he's this successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life, and so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence, but in 2015 he became eligible for parole, and in 2019 he was released. Our next story is called Drunk. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman who we'll call Olivia met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in Western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had had some alcohol. But not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by, and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident. And so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later, they pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though. But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, hey ma'am, have you been drinking tonight? And she would tell them that, well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours. And I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk. But the police were not buying it, and so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100. And while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 0.08% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 0.2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 0.4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, And so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. And so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again, and again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called auto-brewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. The next and final story of today's episode is called Identical Strangers. In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here. What's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie. It's good to have you back here, man." And then walked off. And so Bobby's like, "What is going on here?" And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door. And he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, "Oh, great. Who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not?" So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student said, "Is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, "Yeah."
And so the student goes, okay, my name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you, because they love Eddie, and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie, and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth, they hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, hey Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody thinks I'm you. And then Eddie says, yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too. And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house. And right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby, and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing, and they hugged, and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences, they have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin. After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, they're coming out of the woodwork. So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen. That it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school, we all smoked the same cigarettes, we like the same food, we had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms, and on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all three of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had two identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency, and right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks, and then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the 2 brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in this study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called Three Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become? Or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup. That we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically, in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place, or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study, and so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers.